But right now, I want to welcome to the show NRA past president and now with the Washington Times, Mr. David Keene. David, how are you, sir?
It's a pleasure to be with you, as always.
It's good talking to you again. All right, we knew that this was coming. We knew that the Obama administration supported this arms trade treaty. But today, Secretary of State John Kerry making it official, putting pen to paper. What does this mean, David, in terms of the U.S. now meeting the obligations of this treaty?
Well, the way it works is this. We're not obligated to meet all of the requirements of the treaty until and unless it's ratified by the Senate, which is not going to happen in the current Senate, and in all likelihood won't happen in a future Senate. The NRA helped 58 senators put together a letter earlier on that said that they had no intention of ratifying this. So that's not going to happen. But remember back to the Clinton administration and the Kyoto Treaty, which also didn't have the votes to be ratified. So the President Clinton at that time decided not to send it to the Senate, but to try to, through executive orders, through piecemeal legislation, through arguments and persuasion, to get as many people to comply with provisions of the treaty as possible. The reason for this and the rationale behind it is that once a nation signs a treaty, it's not supposed to do anything inconsistent with it, which is different from implementing the entire thing. So the fact that the treaty has been signed by the United States government is a serious threat in itself, which we're going to have to be very careful of as we look at what goes on in the Congress in the next few years. Because, first of all, a treaty never dies. It will sit at the desk in the Senate and can be brought up at any time, 5 years from now, 2 months from now, a decade from now. But secondly, whatever the president does to try and implement parts of this treaty is going to have to require government money, and so we're going to have to recognize where that money's coming from and try and stop it with appropriations riders, as they call them, in the Congress when and if he attempts to do that.
Absolutely. Earlier today I spoke with Ted Broman of the Heritage Foundation about how the administration could try to implement some of these provisions. And one of the areas that he expressed some concern is in both imports and exports. We know
that's exactly right. One of the things the treaty does, for example, is ban imports into countries that are human rights violators. Now, that sounds fine. The United States, however, under what many in the UN believe is a requirement that if you allow the civilian ownership of firearms, you are definitionally a human rights violator. And remember, Communist China has leveled human rights charges against the United States on the basis of the fact that we allow private citizens to own firearms. The underlying documents in this treaty and the United Nations specifically reject the concept of individual self-defense, or that firearms should be owned for that purpose. And while the treaty itself is vague, it requires nations to implement national strategies that go along with it. Some of those things would be a gun registry, licensing, rules on how to store firearms, restrictions on who gets firearms. It's interesting because when you read through the so-called module that the UN has constructed, a sort of set of laws that nations ought to consider passing, it's as if it was drafted by Mike Bloomberg's assistant. Maybe for all we know it was. But what does it do? It requires universal background checks. It eliminates any private sales or any sales except at a licensed gun dealer. It requires periodic relicensing of anyone who owns a firearm. It has regulations for storage of firearms. It outlaws high-capacity magazines and what Dianne Feinstein likes to call assault weapons. So it's as if it were the Obama administration and Mayor Bloomberg's legislative agenda translated into an international document. And that is, in fact, what this amounts to. Because early on, the anti-gun movement, when it began failing in Congress and failing in the state legislatures and finally failing all the way up to the Supreme Court, began looking for other ways to accomplish its objectives. And beginning in 2001, great focus was placed on the United Nations and on this treaty, which has been worked up in the interim period. So it is a real danger. We've been tracking it, as I think you probably know, Cam, for not just since 2001, but we've had an eye on the UN for some time before that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And early on, very few gun owners really saw the UN as a threat. They didn't particularly like it, but they said, we had Teddy Kennedy, and now we got Chuck Schumer. We've got problems here at home. Now we've got Barack Obama. But what's really happened is that much of the anti-gun movement has moved its activities to the United Nations. And when I was up there, George W. Bush appointed me as a delegate to the last small arms conference. These things were taking place every 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it was clear that if they got something like this, even if we stop them here, the signatories could be prohibited from sending small arms and sporting arms to the United States. The signatories are going to include the European community, Turkey, Brazil, places that make many of the arms that the small arms that we purchase here. And while the Secretary of State and the President will no doubt say the same thing, this is no threat to our Second Amendment rights. It has nothing to do with sporting arms and with small arms that we use for self-defense. The NRA and other countries that share our values have consistently, since 2001, asked that this treaty be restricted to military weapons, anti-tank guns and all the like, and the UN has explicitly refused to do that, which in a great stroke of irony, it seems to me, today the Prime Minister of Canada refused to sign it on the grounds that it would threaten the firearm ownership rights of the Canadian people and force the Canadian government to reinstitute the gun registry that they just abolished because it cost them billions of dollars and didn't serve any legitimate purpose.
Well, you know what they say about those Canadians, David. They're really extremists,
That's right. I think it's an ironic situation when Canada, without a Second Amendment, has a government that is more cognizant of the international threat to gun rights than is the President of the United States, which is a nation that does have a Second Amendment in its Constitution and Bill of Rights.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I'm still trying to figure out, David. We had just a couple of weeks ago the President tell us that the United Nations was a weak body, was a body that couldn't police international norms and standards when it comes to the use of chemical weapons. But apparently this is the right body to deal with your right to keep and bear arms and my right to keep and bear arms?
Well, what he's trying to do with this, obviously, is increase his ability to argue that we need to do something because the international community agrees with him. You know that he's got common sense solutions to all of our problems, and every reasonable person agrees with him. And he's trying to, in essence, in a rhetorical sense with the media, to take the moral high ground, saying the civilized world wants us to do this. I, as President of the United States, have joined in this effort and have an obligation to do it. So he doesn't think the UN is that great a place, except to the extent that he can take his agenda, plug it into the United Nations, and then use it to argue for action in this country. Because the UN can't regulate firearms ownership in the United States. The President of the United States and the Congress have to do that, and that's what he wants to do. That's what he's wanted to do from the beginning and what he wants to do today, and this is just another way for him to make the argument that we ought to be able to do that.
Talking with David Keene, NRA past president, editorial and opinion editor for the Washington Times. David, we talked about imports into this country. What about exports? Do you think the administration could try to use the power of the executive branch to prevent U.S. manufacturers from exporting overseas?
Well, they could, and if the treaty were in force and we ratified it, we wouldn't be able to give firearms to the rebels in Syria right now, which I guess the UN's weak on that, so the president will go ahead and do what he wants. But yes, it could be used for that reason now, and we can do that unilaterally now. If the president wants to not allow for national security reasons or because of human rights violations or whatever he thinks is a rational reason to prohibit the export of military arms, he could do that even without the treaty. But the treaty would make it easier. It would give him cover to perhaps accomplish some of the things that he'd like to do anyway.
All right. Listen, David, again, I really appreciate you coming on the program, sir. I know you all at the Washington Times are going to be covering this. You've been all over the issue. I really appreciate you talking to us today and hope we can do it again soon.
Anytime.